Hello, Robert Mitchell here, and welcome to Christianity for Doubters, Episode 5, The Wisdom of the Hebrews. So, if you're new to my channel, I am an author, a martial artist, a seminarian, and a deacon in the old Catholic tradition. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to get into a little bit of wisdom. Now, the wisdom we're going to talk about, well, let's recap. So, in episode 1, we talked about the urgent need for wisdom and what's wrong with the world today and why it needs wisdom. And then in episode 2, we talked a little bit about the Christian psychotechnology and how Christianity and religions in general are psychotechnologies that actually allow us to get things done in the world. That we talked a little bit about how religion has evolved in the same way that behaviors have evolved among animals. These are things that help humans do human. So in other words, we've offloaded a lot of what it takes to raise humans to the culture and to the religions. In the same way that for some reason, whales sing songs and salmon swim upstream and wildebeests and geese migrate, and that to some extent also people who are railing and wailing and screaming at religion to just stop in some way are like whales screaming at the other whales to stop singing their songs. And that there's a purpose to these things that's ingrained in us, that's co-evolved. And so religion is going to be there whether we want it to be or not. And so if you take out religion, then people will often insert something else in its place, like political ideologies and other other types of structures of knowledge or ways of thinking to fill the void that religion fills in the human psyche. And then in episode 3, we talked about Christian myth-busting, and hopefully I busted enough of the most common anti-Christian myths that you were able to move on and make it to episode 4, which was the existence of God. In that episode, we talked a little bit about, we talked about two of the what I think are the best proofs for the existence of God, the cosmological argument. And then my personal argument, which I think might be unique to me, and that's the what I call the evolution of consciousness, argument. And now we're going to go to the wisdom of the Hebrews. So let me just tell you briefly what my argument sequence is. So this works like this. What I'm basically saying is that the world needs wisdom. The wisdom of Christianity is the most popular and most pervasive type of wisdom in the world, the most successful wisdom tradition the world has ever known. And so if I'm going to then my goal was to make you at least receptive to the idea of Christianity. Now we're going to talk a little bit about, in episode 3, we talked about how Christianity is not dumb, it's a real thing. Then I said God exists. And so now the premise is going to be the Hebrews have wisdom. And I'm going to assert that maybe the reason that we can say that they had wisdom is because they had an encounter with God. Now, if I'm going to assert that the Hebrews had an encounter with God, then I have to at least if that was true, let's say for a moment it's true. If it's true that the Hebrews had an encounter with God, then shouldn't we be able to see that there was something incredibly powerful, unique, and revolutionary going on with the Hebrews in the ancient Near East. We should be able to say that. So I want to say this, and I'm going to try to prove to you that something unique was going on. And I'm going to give you the arguments, not just my arguments, because for all you know, I could just be some guy, right? I give you some pretty dicey credentials and then I just talk a lot. So I'm going to use some eminent teachers, professors. I'm going to play some of their videos, and I'm going to let you see some really smart people say this stuff, people who are smarter than me and who teach at places like Yale and Harvard, who are not preachers and are not deacons and are not seminarians necessarily. One of them is. But I want to begin by letting you know that, and I hinted at this in the Christian myth-busting episode, I want to remind you that you're not the first person to have the objections that you have. You're not the first person to do it. So I'm looking for a note here. I've got a note I want to share with you. I'll put it in here somewhere. Let me just pause a second. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. So there was a book that was written in 313 AD by Lactantius. And Lactantius wrote a book called On the Wrath of God. And in this book, he quotes Epicurus, an objection of Epicurus to the existence of God. And he writes the following, and these are the words he attributes to Epicurus. Either God wants to abolish evil and cannot, or he can but does not want to. If he can but does not want to abolish evil, and God really wants to do it, why is there evil? Either God wants to abolish evil and cannot, or he can but does not want to. If he can but does not want to, he is wicked. If God can abolish evil and God really wants to do it, why is there evil in the world? And so this is an objection that's 1700 and some odd years old at this point. And yet, if you're a doubter, if you're an atheist, then you might think that you're the first person to question the existence of God because of evil in the world. But you're not. Maybe you're an atheist, maybe you're a person who had faith and lost it. But faith gets tried, faith gets tested. But there are answers for these things, and I touched upon the arguments over the so-called problem of evil. And it's going to come up again in this talk because it's a pervasive question. But you're not the first person to ask it. It turns out that there's lots and lots and lots of answers for that. I also want to point this out, and I think this is important too. And by the way, I'm going to apologize now for something. In the first episode, I said I was going to try to keep these videos short, 20 to 40 minutes. It's just not possible. That became clear early on. You just can't dig deep enough. And I really hope that what a lot of folks are saying is true, which is that people will listen to and watch really long videos, that people have a longer attention span than we give them credit for. I sure hope that's true because this one's going to be over an hour, I feel sure, but we're going to go ahead and dig in. No, but this one, this is a perfect transition to the wisdom of the Hebrews. So this book is called the Book of Wisdom. And it comes from the Septuagint. It was written about 100 BC by Jews living in Alexandria, which is part of the Greek Empire in northern Egypt. And see if you can hear yourself and some of your objections in this piece, in this thing. And let's see what what wisdom the ancient Hebrews could give you now 2,200 years later, roughly. It was the wicked who with hands and words invited death, considered it a friend and pined for it and made a covenant with it, because they deserved to be allied with it. For, not thinking rightly, they said amongst themselves, "Brief and troubled is our lifetime, there is no remedy for our dying. Nor is any one known to have come back from Hades. For by mere chance were we born. In hereafter we shall be as though we had not been, because the breath in our nostrils is smoke, and reason a spark from the beating of our hearts. And when this is quenched, our body will be ashes, and our spirit will be poured abroad like the empty air. Even our name will be forgotten in time, and no one will recall our deeds. So our life will pass away like the traces of a cloud, and will be dispersed like a mist, pursued by the sun's rays, and overpowered by its heat. For our lifetime is the passing of a shadow, and our dying cannot be deferred, because it is fixed with a seal, and no one returns. Come, therefore, let us enjoy the good things that are here, and make use of creation with youthful zest. Let us have our fill of costly wine and perfumes, and let no springtime blossom pass us by. Let us crown ourselves with rosebuds before they wither. Let no meadow be free from our wantonness. Everywhere let us leave tokens of our merriment, for this is our portion and this is our lot. Let us oppress the righteous poor. Let us neither spare the widow, nor revere the aged for hair grown white with time. But let our strength be our norm of righteousness, for weakness proves useless. Let us lie in wait for the righteous one, because he is annoying to us. He opposes our actions, reproaches us for our transgressions of the law, and charges us with violations of our training. He professes to have knowledge of God and styles himself a child of the Lord. To us he is a censure of our thoughts. Merely to see him is a hardship for us. Because his life is not like that of others, and different are his ways. He judges us debased. He holds aloof from our paths, as from things impure. He calls blessed the destiny of the righteous, and boasts that God is his Father. Let us see whether his words be true. Let us find out what will happen to him in the end. For if the righteous one is the Son of God, God will help him and deliver him from the hand of his foes. With violence and torture let us put him to the test, that we may have proof of his gentleness and try his patience. Let us condemn him to shameful death. For according to his own words, God will take care of him. These were their thoughts, but they erred, for their wickedness blinded them, and they did not know the hidden counsels of God. Nor did they count on a recompense for holiness, nor discern the innocent soul's reward. For God formed us to be imperishable. For the image of his own nature he made us. By the envy of the devil, death entered the world, and they who are allied with him experience it. And so that's just what you see. That's just what you see. Is in the world today is a lack of wisdom, and people crying out that all this religion stuff is foolishness, and we should just have fun, and in the end, it always ends up in the same place. Strength's the only thing that matters. Pleasure is the only thing that's important. do what you will, and so on. All right, so enough of me preaching. Now we're going to get on. If you survived that little bit, then we can begin to move to some really smart people other than me talking. So this is Professor Christine Hayes, who did some lectures for Yale University, and these are loaded up on the internet. And this is the second lecture of her The Hebrew Bible in its Ancient Near Eastern Setting. And it's a fantastic class, and it's free, and I'm going to put links up here to it. So I want you to listen to this lecture, and I'm going to step in from time to time and keep this thing on track and try to keep it interesting and focused for you. And here we go.
I mentioned in the opening lecture that this course is going to examine the biblical corpus from a variety of different viewpoints and take a variety of approaches: historical, literary, religious, cultural. And today we are going to begin our appraisal of the first portion of the Bible as the product of a religious and cultural revolution. The Bible is the product of minds that were exposed to and influenced by and reacting to the ideas and cultures of their day. And as I suggested in the opening lecture, comparative study of the literature of the ancient Near East and the Bible reveals the shared cultural and literary heritage at the same time that it reveals great differences between the two. In the literature of the Bible, some members of Israelite society, probably a cultural, religious, and literary elite, broke radically with the prevailing norms of the day. They mounted a critique of prevailing norms. The persons responsible for the final editing and shaping of the Bible, somewhere from the 7th to the 5th or 4th century BCE, right? We're not totally sure, and we'll talk more about that. But those final editors were members of this group, and they had a specific worldview, and they imposed that worldview on the older traditions and stories that are found in the Bible. That radical new worldview in the Bible was monotheism. But why, you might ask, should the idea of one God instead of many be so radical? What is so different? What's different about having a one God from having a pantheon of gods headed by a superior God? What is so new and revolutionary about monotheism? Well, according to one school of thought, there isn't anything particularly revolutionary about monotheism. And the classical account of the rise of monotheism that has prevailed for a very long time runs as follows, and I have a little flow chart here to illustrate it for you. The argument goes that in every society, there's a natural progression from polytheism, which is the belief in many gods. Usually these are personifications of natural forces, to henotheism, heno, one God, or monolatry, which is really the worship of one God as supreme over other gods. So not denying the existence of the other gods, ascribing reality to them, but isolating one as the supreme God, and on to monotheism, where essentially one believes only in the reality of one God. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, this progression was viewed as an advance, which is not very surprising because the whole theory was put forward by scholars who were basically Western monotheists. And these scholars maintained that certain elements of biblical religion represented pure religion. Religion evolved to its highest form, no longer tainted by pagan and polytheistic elements of Canaanite religion generally. So applying an evolutionary model to religion carried with it a very clear value judgment. Polytheism was understood as clearly inferior and primitive. Monolatry was an improvement, right? It was getting better, it was getting closer, but monotheism was judged to be the best and purest form of religion. And at first, the great archaeological discoveries that I talked about last time in the 19th century seemed to support this claim that Israelite monotheism had evolved from ancient Near Eastern polytheism. Cuneiform tablets that were inscribed with the great literature of Mesopotamian civilizations were uncovered, and when they were deciphered, they shed astonishing light on biblical religion. And these discoveries led to a kind of parallelomania. That's how it's referred to in the literature. Scholars delighted in pointing out all of the parallels in theme and language and plot and structure between biblical stories and ancient Near Eastern stories. So more than 1,000 years before the Israelite legend of Noah and the Ark, you have Mesopotamians telling the story of Ziusudra, or in some versions, Utnapishtim, who also survived a great flood by building an ark on the instruction of a deity, and the flood destroys all life, and he sends out birds to scout out the dry land, and so on. So with parallels like these, it was argued, it was clear that the religion of the Israelites was not so different from the religions of their polytheistic or pagan neighbors. They also had a creation story. They had a flood story. They did animal sacrifices. They observed purity taboos. Israelite religion was another ancient Near Eastern religion, and they differed from their neighbors only over the number of gods they worshipped, one or many. It was just a more refined, more highly evolved version of ancient Near Eastern religion. Well, this view, this evolutionary view or evolutionary model, was challenged by a man named Yechezkel Kaufman in the 1930s. And Kaufman argued that monotheism does not and cannot evolve from polytheism because the two are based on radically divergent worldviews, radically divergent intuitions about reality. And in a multi-volume work, which was later translated and abridged, and you've got a selection of reading from the translated abridgment, so it's translated by Moshe Greenberg, an abridged version of his massive work, The Religion of Israel, Kaufman asserted that the monotheism of Israel couldn't be the natural outgrowth of the polytheism of an earlier age. It was a radical break with it. It was a total cultural and religious discontinuity. It was a polemic against polytheism and the pagan worldview.
Sorry about that, guys. A little technical difficulty, so I got to go back here.
Of Kaufman's model is that we avoid some of this pejorative, we can avoid some of the pejorative evaluations of polytheism as primitive, right, as necessarily earlier and primitive and inferior. They're simply positing the existence of two distinct orientations, two divergent worldviews. They each have their explanatory merits, and they each have their specific problems and difficulties. It's not to say that Kaufman wasn't clearly judgmental, but at least the potential is there for us to understand these as two distinct systems, each, again, as I say, with its explanatory merits. But as we'll see, some of the things that monotheism solves only invite other sorts of problems that it has to wrestle with throughout its long life.
So she's alluding here to the problem of evil is one of the primary problems, and we're going to get to that. But the problem of evil, for Christians at least, has been solved for the most part. At least there are a number of very, very good solutions for it. Clearly, it does, as I said before, rear its head. But I think what I want to focus on this week in this week's video is the fact that we already have a scholar here in Yechezkel Kaufman and in Christine Hayes positing that the Hebrews had a profound break from their philosophy was a profound break in their religion from what was happening in the ancient Near East at the time. So we're going to get into more detail. Here we go.
Now, in Kaufman's view, the similarities, therefore, between the Israelites and ancient Near Eastern religion and cultures that everyone was so busily finding and celebrating, these were, in the end, similarities in form and external structure, appearance. They weren't essential similarities. They differed in content. Sure, they both have animal sacrifice. Sure, they both have ritual purity laws. Sure, they share certain stories and legends. But these have been adopted by the Israelites and transformed into vehicles that convey the basic ideas of the monotheistic worldview. So a similarity in form doesn't mean a similarity in function. And in this, Kaufman's anticipating arguments made by anthropologists. The ritual cult of the Israelites may look like that of their neighbors, but it functioned very differently. Its purpose was drastically different from that of Israel's neighbors. The Israelites, like their neighbors, may have set up a king over themselves, but Israelite monarchy differed from Canaanite monarchy in significant ways because of their monotheism. These are all things we will test and explore. So the meaning and function of Israel's cult, of Israel's king, of its creation stories, or any of its other narratives, they derive from the place of those items within the larger cultural framework or worldview of Israel, and that larger framework or worldview is one of basic monotheism. So let's turn then to Kaufman's description of the fundamental distinction between the polytheistic worldview and the revolutionary monotheistic worldview that took root in Israel. And I am going to be rehearsing and then critiquing the arguments that are in that 100-page reading that I assigned for you this week. This is the only time something like this will happen in the course. And I do that because these ideas are so fundamental, and we are going to be wrestling with them throughout the course. So it's important to me that you absorb this stuff right from the beginning and think about it and be critical of it and engage it.
So it's remarkable because this is, and what gets me is that this is so important and so remarkable, and yet no one knows it. In fact, a lot of even the Christian people that I know don't know this stuff, and this is so important.
Kaufman's ideas are very important. They're also overstated in some ways, and that's why we're going to be wrestling with some of these ideas throughout the course. So let's begin with Kaufman's characterization of what he calls pagan religion, right? That's the term that he uses. The fundamental idea of pagan religion, he says, and I quote, the idea that there exists a realm of being prior to the gods and above them, upon which they depend and whose decrees even they must obey, the meta-divine realm. This is the realm of supreme and ultimate power, and it transcends the deities. All right? The deity or the deities emerge from and are therefore subject to the laws of the meta-divine realm, the forces and powers of the meta-divine realm. And the nature of this realm will vary from pagan tradition to pagan tradition. It might be water. It might be darkness. It might be spirit. Or in ancient Greek religion, a more sort of philosophical polytheism, it might be fate. Even the gods are subject to the decrees of fate. They have no control over that. Kaufman asserts, therefore, this belief, once you posit a primordial realm, some realm that is beside or beyond the gods, that's independent of them and primary, you have automatically limited the gods. So what I've done is I've spelled out here for you consequences, logical consequences of positing a meta-divine realm. You know, once you have a meta-divine realm, all of these things are going to follow. The gods are going to be limited. All right? They are not the source of all. They are bound by, they're subservient to this meta-divine realm. There can therefore be no notion of a supreme divine will, an absolute or sovereign divine will. The will of any one God ultimately can be countered by the decrees of the primordial realm, and the will of all the gods can be thwarted by the decrees of the primordial realm. The will of any one God can be thwarted by perhaps another God. All right? So the gods are limited in power. They're also limited in their wisdom. That falls under this as well. They're not going to be all-knowing or all-wise because of the existence of this realm that's beyond them, and which is in many ways mysterious to them as well. It's unpredictable to them too. It's not in their control or in their power. Individual gods might be very wise. They might be wise in particular crafts. They might be a god of healing, very, very wise in healing, or a god of some other craft or area of knowledge, but they possess wisdom as an attribute, not as an essential characteristic. Kaufman asserts that mythology is basic to pagan religions. Mythologies are the lives or tales of the lives of gods. Tales of the lives of the gods. In pagan religions, the gods are born. And they live lives very similar to human lives, but on a grand scale. And then they die. They might be reborn too. Pagan religions contain theogonies, the birth of a god, theogony, accounts of the births of gods. Now, this impersonal primordial realm, Kaufman declares, contains the seeds of all beings. Very often in these creation stories, there is some sense of some realm from which life begins to emerge, usually beginning with gods. So these cosmogonies and theogonies will describe the generation of sexually differentiated divine beings, also the generation of the natural world, also the generation of human beings and animals. In other words, this is the primordial womb for all that is, divine, human, and natural. It is the source of everything mundane and divine. What that means, Kaufman asserts, is that in pagan religion there's very often a fluid boundary between the divine, the human, and the natural worlds. They blur into one another because they all emerge ultimately from this same primordial world stuff. Right? The distinctions between them are soft. We see this in the fact that gods are very often associated with natural powerful forces. Right? The sky is a god. The fire is a god. Fertility, a natural process, is a god. So there's no real distinction between the worship of gods and the worship of nature. Second, he says, because humans also emerge ultimately from this primordial realm, there's a confusion of the boundary between the divine and the human. That's common, he says. He chooses the word confusion. That's common in pagan religion. And so we often have in pagan religions unions between divine beings and human beings. Kaufman argues, and I quote, that the continuity between the divine and human realm is at the basis of the pagan belief in apotheosis, humans becoming gods, perhaps after death, for example, becoming immortal, or very often kings, when they ascend to the throne, become gods. Whatever power the gods have, Kaufman says, is not due to the fact that their will is absolute or their spirit is absolute. The realm that transcends the gods, this meta-divine realm, is that which has ultimate power. And the stuff of which it is made is what has ultimate power. So power is materially conceived. It inheres in certain things, in certain substances, particularly substances or materials that are deeply connected to whatever this primordial world stuff is. So if it's blood, then blood that courses through the veins of living creatures is seen to have some deep and powerful connection with the meta-divine realm, and that is where power resides. If it is water, then water will be viewed as particularly materially powerful in that particular system. So gods have power only insofar as they are connected with that primordial world stuff, a technical term that I used throughout this lecture. That means that magic is possible in such a system. Because power is materially conceived, in other words, since it is believed to inhere in certain natural substances that resemble or are connected to the primordial world stuff, that's the source of all power, then magic is possible by manipulating those material substances in certain ways. It might be clay, it might be water, it might be blood. Then whatever is believed to hold the power of this primordial life force, humans can tap into and influence the activities of the meta-divine realm. So through manipulation, magical manipulations of certain substances, they can harness, Kaufman says, they can harness these forces, these independent self-operating forces. And so the human magician is really a technician, and he can make these forces come to bear on even the gods, to coerce the gods to do his will, and so on. So magic in a pagan system, Kaufman claims, is a way of getting around the gods, circumventing the capricious will of the gods and demons, because magic is directed at the meta-divine realm, trying to tap into its powers. It's not directed at the gods. It's trying to tap into the ultimate source of power, to use that power to influence the gods.
Now, you can definitely do it. So imagine if you went up to the corner there where she's pointing, and you said where she's drawn the circle around the meta-divine realm. And so what if you just put science in there? So today we have people who believe that science answers everything. And so I'm not talking about scientists or people who believe in science. I'm talking about scientism. So there's people who have elevated science to the highest possible dimension. And so there's this belief that, well, you don't have to worry about morality or any of that. All you have to do is follow science. And science answers all the questions, and it's only science. And if you can just tap into science, you can solve any problem or do anything you want. You can go around the gods, and the gods are irrelevant and unimportant. That's scientism. I could do 15 lectures on that topic, but we're just going to keep going. Now, she's explaining the pagan worldview. Now, here in a minute, she's going to show you the Hebrew worldview, and you're going to see how different it is and how radically different it is.
In a particular way, or protect oneself against the gods. Similarly, divination. Divination is an attempt to discern the future that's once again heads right to the source of power. It's not directed at the gods, unless you're hoping to use them as a medium through which to get access to the meta-divine realm. But ultimately, most divination is aimed at untapping the secrets and of the meta-divine realm and not the gods. Discerning the will of the gods is really of little use, right? Because even their will can be thwarted or overthrown by other gods or by the decrees of the meta-divine realm. The pagan cult, Kaufman claims, is a system of rites. I use the word cult, and every year people look at me and say, what is cult? I don't even understand what that means. We'll learn more about cult. But it refers to a system of rites. Okay, a system of rites, and we'll be looking at the Israelite cult later. So the pagan cult, he says, is a system of rites that involves the manipulation of substances, again, blood, animal flesh.
She's using rites as R-I-T-E-S, not R-I-G-H-T-S, rites, rituals.
Human flesh, precious metals, and so on, that are believed to have some kind of inherent power, again, because of their connection to whatever the primordial world stuff may be in that tradition. So, according to Kaufman, there's always an element of magic in the pagan cult. It's seeking, through these rituals and manipulations of certain substances, to, again, let loose certain powers, set into motion certain forces that will coerce a god to be propitiated, for example, or calmed, or to act favorably, or to vindicate the devotees, and so on. Some of these cultic acts might be defensive or protective, so that the god cannot harm the worshipper. Many of the cultic festivals are keyed in to mythology, the stories of the lives of the gods. Many of the cultic festivals will be reenactments of events in the life of the god. A battle that the god had, the death of the god. Usually in the winter, cultic rituals will reenact the death of the god. And then in spring, the rising or resurrection of the god. These are all reenactment festivals that occur very often. And it's believed that by reenacting these festivals in this cultic way, one brings magical powers into play and can in fact ensure and maintain the reemergence of life in the spring. And so it's essential for the maintenance, preservation of world. One final and very important point, and we're going to wrestle with this quite a bit during the year. Kaufman claims, again, in the polytheistic worldview, the primordial realm contains the seeds of all being. Everything is generated from that realm, good and bad. So just as there are...
Now, I want you to make a mental note of this. In the pagan worldview, the meta-divine realm contains the seeds of both good and evil. Because I'm going to wrap this up with a little comment about the seed analogy and why it's so critically important. So pay attention, okay?
Are good gods who might protect human beings. There are also evil gods who seek to destroy both humans and other gods. Death and disease are consigned to the realm of these evil demons or these impure evil spirits, but they are siblings with the good gods. Human beings are basically powerless, he says, in the continual cosmic struggle between the good gods and the evil demons, unless they can utilize magic, divination, tap into the powers of the meta-divine realm, circumvent the gods who might be making their lives rather miserable. But what's important is that Kaufman insists that in the pagan view, evil is an autonomous demonic realm. It is as primary and real as the realm of the holy or good gods. Evil is a metaphysical reality. It is built into the structure of the universe. That's the way the universe was made. The primordial stuff that spawned all that is, spawned it good and bad and exactly as it is, and it's there and it's real. Salvation, he says, is the concern of humans. The gods aren't interested in human salvation. They're from the capricious forces and powers in the world because they're trying to save themselves. You know, the good gods are being attacked by the evil gods. The powers and decrees of the meta-divine realm are hassling them as well as anybody else. So they can't be worried about humans. They're worried about themselves. Salvation is attained through magic, or Gnostic means. Gnosticism refers to knowledge of secrets that can in some way liberate one from the regular rules. And so as long as one can somehow circumvent the gods, tie oneself into the powers of the meta-divine realm to be beyond the reach of the demons and the capricious gods who make life on earth a misery, that is the path for salvation. So Kaufman says that the pagan worldview is one of an amoral universe, somewhere around here. There we go, amoral universe. Not a moral universe, not an immoral universe, but an amoral universe. It is morally neutral. There are gods who are legislators and guardians of social order.
So that's the world that atheists and doubters live in. There is no morality. It is an amoral reality. And we can make up whatever rules we want. We can decide that this is good and that's bad. And we can just say, like a lot of atheists are continually saying, that, you know, we can just be good. We don't need religion. We can just be good. Despite the fact that people will not be good. And they most strenuously insist that they don't want to be good. And that in the ancient world, all sorts of evil was perpetrated. And that the world is more peaceful now than it's ever been. And that's largely due to the effects of various religions. But let's go ahead. Sorry, I can't help it.
Order and justice. But their laws aren't absolute. They can be leveled by the decrees of the supreme meta-divine realm. And since the knowledge and wisdom of each god is limited, morality can be defined as what a particular god likes or desires, and that may be different from what another god likes or desires, and there's no absolute morality then. And it's that picture of the universe, Kaufman wants to argue, that is challenged by the monotheistic revolution, again, right, he sees this as a revolution of ancient Israel. So according to Kaufman, the fundamental idea of ancient Israelite writing, which receives no systematic formulation, but permeates the entire Bible, in his view, is a radically new idea of a God who is himself the source of all being, not subject to a meta-divine realm. There's no transcendent cosmic order or power. He does not emerge from some pre-existing realm, and therefore he is free of all of the limitations of myth and magic. We'll go through these one by one, but a God whose will is absolute and sovereign. All right? So what then are the implications of the elimination of this meta-divine realm? All right, there, just as these points flowed logically from positing a meta-divine realm, what flows logically from eliminating a meta-divine realm and positing simply a God that does not emerge from any pre-existing power or order or realm? Well, first of all, there's no theogony or mythology in the Bible. God isn't born from some primordial womb. He doesn't have a life story. There's no realm that is primary to him or prior to him, and there is no realm that is the source of his power and wisdom. So in the opening chapters of Genesis, God simply is. He doesn't grow, he doesn't age, he doesn't mature, he doesn't have in the Bible a female consort. God doesn't die. So in the Hebrew Bible, Kaufman claims, for the first time in history, we meet an unlimited God who's timeless and ageless and non-physical and eternal.
Timeless, ageless, non-physical, and eternal. Timeless, ageless, non-physical, and eternal. And if you remember, when we did Christian myth busting and we talked about the cosmological argument for the existence of God, we determined that since the universe began with a Big Bang, before which there was neither time nor matter, and since everything that it begins to exist has a cause, then we determined that the cause of the universe would have to be timeless and immaterial. Just going to let that sink in for a second.
That means that this God transcends nature. Which means we're going to get rid of number 3 as well, right? As the sovereign of all realms, God isn't by nature bound to any particular realm. He's not identifiable as a force of nature or identified with a force of nature. Nature certainly becomes the stage of God's expression of his will. He expresses his will and purpose through forces of nature in the Bible, but nature isn't God himself. He's not identified. He is wholly other. He isn't kin to humans in any way either. So there is no blurring, no soft boundary between humans and the divine, according to Kaufman, in the Bible. There's no apotheosis in the Bible, no life after death in the Bible either. Did you know that? Have to wait a few centuries for that idea to come along. But certainly not in the Hebrew Bible. People live 70 years and that's it. So there's no process by which humans become gods, and certainly no process in the reverse as well. Magic in the Hebrew Bible is represented as useless. It's pointless. There's no meta-divine realm to tap into. Power doesn't adhere in any stuff in the natural world. So the world is sort of de-divinized, right? Demythologized. Power isn't understood as a material thing or something that adheres in material substances. God can't be manipulated or coerced by charms or words or rituals. They have no power and cannot be used in that way. And so magic is sin. Magic is sin or rebellion against God because it's predicated on a whole mistaken notion of God having limited power. There are magical conceptions throughout the Bible. You're going to run into them. But interestingly enough, the editors of the stories in which they appear will very often hammer home the conclusion that actually what happened because God willed it to happen. The event occurred because God wanted it to occur. It didn't occur independently of his will or by virtue of some power that's inherent in the magician's artifices. So Kaufman argues that magic in the Bible is recast as a witness to God's sovereignty, God's power. And they're stripped, magical actions are stripped of their autonomous potency. Again, they're serving as vehicles then for the manifestation of the will of God. Divination is also unassimilable to the monotheistic idea, according to Kaufman, because it also presupposes the existence of some meta-divine realm, some source of power, knowledge, or information that transcends God. And again, it's an attempt to reveal God's secrets in an ungodly way, predicated on a mistake. It is permitted to make inquiries of God through oracular devices, but God only conveys information at his own will. There's no ritual or incantation, Kaufman says, or material substance that can coerce a revelation from God. So we will see things that look like magic and divination and oracles and dreams and prophecy in the pagan world and in ancient Israel. But Kaufman says the similarity is a similarity in form only, and it's a superficial, formal, external similarity. Each of these phenomena, he says, is transformed by the basic Israelite idea of one supreme transcendent God, whose will is absolute, and all of these things relate to the direct word and will of God. They aren't.
So, it's interesting. So, the Hebrews claim that they have a unique relationship with God and that everything is different. So unlike anyone else in any of the neighboring tribes in the ancient Near East, in the area in which they lived, there's just nothing like it. It's remarkable, isn't it?
Recourse to a separate science or lore or body of knowledge or interpretive craft that calls upon forces or powers that transcend God or are independent of God. By the same token, the cult, Kaufman says, has no automatic or material power. It's not just sort of a place where certain kinds of magical coercive acts happen. The cult isn't designed to service the material needs of God either. It doesn't affect his life and vitality by enacting certain rituals. You don't ensure that God doesn't die, and so on. No events in God's life are celebrated, right? The festivals that are carried out in the cultic context. So the mythological rationales for cult that you find amongst Israel's neighbors are replaced, and they're replaced very often by historical rationales. This action is done to commemorate such and such event in the history of the nation.
So the Christian New Year, for example, is a great example of this. So we're not working magic, we're reenacting events from the life of Christ. And in fact, the central ritual of the Christian religion is communion, or if you'd rather call it Mass, is an event from the life of Christ. It is the sharing of the bread and the wine. So this is not an act of magic or some weird magic spell. This is a reenactment in history. And so God is the God of history. He steps into history. All right?
This action is done to commemorate such and such event in the history of the nation. So pagan festivals in Israel, Kaufman says, are historicized, commemorating events in the life of the people and not in the story of the God's life, since we have no mythology. So, but we are going to be spending a fair amount of time talking actually about the meaning and the function of Israel's purity laws and cultic laws in a later lecture. Now, since God is himself the transcendent source of all being, and since he is good, in a monotheistic system, there are no evil agents that constitute a realm that opposes God as an equal rival. No divine evil agents. Again, in the pagan worldview, the primordial womb spawns all sorts of beings, all kinds of divinities, good and evil, that are in equal strength. They're sort of locked in this cosmic struggle. But in the Israelite worldview, if God is the source of all being, then there can't be a realm of supernatural beings that do battle with him. There's no room for a divine antagonist of the one supreme God, which is leading us down here to this point, that sin and evil are demythologized in the Hebrew Bible. And that's very interesting. It's going to lead to a lot of interesting things. It's also going to create a really huge problem for monotheistic thought. They're going to
And what she's talking about, once again, is this whole problem of evil, but we've already answered that, and I gave you an answer for that in the Christian myth-busting episode where we talked about the problem of evil. And so the invention of Christianity is to discuss free will. And so if there is free will, then humans are the primary cause of evil. The other primary cause of evil is obviously physics, wind, rain, storms, and so on, earthquake, disease, and that sort of thing. And then there are the choices of humans, which makes evil, which are people who commit evil acts, none of which are God's fault. But there does exist free will, because we have to freely choose to follow God or not. And so in the Christian worldview, then the angels also have free will, and some of them chose not to play the game, and so they fell. And so that's how we get this semi-autonomous evil. It's not, none of these things are on a par with God. And so we're going to get into the final tidbit in that argument in a much later video in the series. We're only on episode 5. Right now we're talking about the wisdom of the Hebrews. So let me just stop yakking.
Struggle with for centuries, and actually still do struggle with today. But again, in the pagan worldview, sin is understood very often as the work of a demon or an evil god that might possess a person, might have to be exorcised from that person by means of magic. You know, if you tap into some of these substances and you can use the powers in those substances to coerce the demon to be expelled from the person's body. These are things that are very common in polytheistic and pagan practices. But in Israel, we have no meta-divine realm to spawn these evil beings, these various gods. So Israelite religion did not conceive of sin as caused by an independent evil power that exists out there in the universe and is defying the will of God. Instead, evil comes about as a result of the clash of the will of God and the will of humans who happen to have the freedom to rebel. There's nothing inherently supernatural about sin. It's not a force or a power built into the universe. Kaufman is claiming, therefore, that in Israel, evil is transferred from the metaphysical realm built into the physical structure of the universe to the moral realm. I've put it up here for you. Evil is a moral and not a metaphysical reality. It doesn't have a concrete, independent existence. And that means that human beings, and only human beings, are the potential source of evil in the world. Responsibility for evil lies in the hands of human beings. In the Hebrew Bible, no one will ever say, the devil made me do it. There is no devil in the Hebrew Bible. That's also the invention of a much later age. And that is an important and critical ethical revolution. Evil is a moral and not a metaphysical reality. You had a... Great, that's what you get to talk about. Wonderful question. Well, what about when Eve is tempted by the serpent? Who is this serpent? What is he doing? What's going on? What is Kaufman claiming? Okay, that's exactly the kind of stuff that should be popping into your head. What about? Okay, and in section, you're going to be discussing exactly that story. Okay, and that's one of those texts. And in a minute, if I haven't at the end of the lecture, ask again if I haven't kind of gotten to part of an answer to your question. Okay? But again, this emphasis on evil as a moral choice. Think of Genesis 4, where God warns Cain, who's filled with anger and jealousy and is thinking about doing all kinds of horrible things to his brother. And God says, sin crouches at the door, its urges toward you, yet you can be its master. Right? This is a question of moral choice. Final point then is, we're not going to talk about salvation right now, but we're going to talk about the fact that
we're not going to talk about salvation right now, but we're going to talk about salvation later. And it's going to be a big, big deal.
That the only supreme law is the will of God. Because God is a creator God rather than a created God, he's imposed an order upon the cosmos. And so the pagan picture of an amoral universe of just competing powers, good and evil, Kaufman says, is transformed into a picture of a moral cosmos. The highest law is the will of God, and that imposes a morality upon the structure of the universe. So in sum, Kaufman's argument is this. Israel conceived of the divine in an entirely new way. Israel's God differed from the pagan gods in his essential nature. The pagan gods were natural gods. They were very often associated with blind forces of nature, with no intrinsic moral character, he says. And the God of Israel was understood to transcend nature. And his will was not only absolute, it was absolutely good and moral. A lot of people say, well, in a way, didn't we just rename the meta-divine realm God? No, because the difference here is that it's posited not only that this God is the only power, but that he is only good. And that was not the case with the meta-divine realm, right? That was a morally neutral, but there's a moral claim that's being made by the writers of the Hebrew Bible about this supreme power, this God.
Now, that's important because now, in the eyes of the Hebrews, there are no more excuses. You can't just say, oh, well, there's evil in the world. It's like that Bible quote from Wisdom, chapter 2. where it talks about the fact that, you are responsible for this. You can't just say, oh, well, the strong survive and the weak are too bad and so forth. You have to take a stand. It makes the whole world moral. All right? Now I'm going to jump over here to another expert, and this is Shia J.D. Cohen, and this is a Harvard lecture, lecture 10 by Rabbi Cohen, and he's going to talk a little bit about the laws of the Hebrews and the covenant code, and why this seems similar in form, but is actually way different. It seems similar on the surface to the laws of their neighbors, but it's way, way different. All right?
In the Ten Commandments, we have laws that are common to most human societies. The obvious ones are prohibition of murder, theft, adultery. Different societies will define these terms in different ways, to be sure, but it is very common in human civilized societies that there are such prohibitions. Similarly, a commandment to honor one's parents. Footnote, usually it's parents who write these laws, so there's a commandment to honor your parents. If children wrote the laws, there would be a commandment to love your children, but there is no such commandment. Anyway, back to where I am. So in human societies, the grown-ups write the laws, so of course they demand that you honor your parents and you honor your elders. So these commandments you find everywhere in human society, from the Alus to the Zulus, and everybody in between, right? You're going to find commandments such as these. But the Ten Commandments also has laws that are uniquely Israelite, and I would say this applies to the laws of the Torah in general. Some of them are typical, as we'll see, typical laws, whereas others are uniquely Israelite. So the Ten Commandments, the two that are uniquely Israelite are the prohibition of worshiping any god other than God, other than the Lord, other than YHWH. That is a quintessentially Israelite prohibition. You may worship only the Lord, have no other gods before me. And the other one is the Sabbath. Scholars have labored long and hard to find some ancient Near Eastern analog to the Sabbath, and there are analogs at best. Parallels, no. Exactly the same thing, for sure not. So this notion of the Sabbath, a day off every seventh day, seems to be an Israelite invention, or an Israelite contribution, or Israelite specific. And you should be happy, class, because that's where we get weekends. Comes out of the Decalogue. Without the Israelites, you would not have a weekend.
The Decalogue, by the way, is the Ten Commandments. Deca being 10.
You think I'm funny. I'm being serious. This is an Israelite, then Jewish, then Christian, then Western idea. Okay, small footnote. Thou shalt not kill is usually translated, but that's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew says, thou shalt not murder. I'm not sure exactly what murder means. We can sit around and try to define what exactly is murder, but it is not a prohibition of killing, it is a prohibition of murder. Similarly, what does adultery mean? Different societies will define adultery in different terms. Okay, we can argue about that too, but all these things require interpretation. Okay, next point on this about these laws. This distinction between laws that are common and laws that are Israelite specific, by the time you get to medieval philosophers, they turn that distinction into a distinction between laws that are rational or laws that are revelatory.
Now, this is just what you would expect, by the way, if a culture had an authentic encounter with God. That there would be no distinction between the types of laws. Now, we can distinguish between civil laws and criminal laws, but for them, these things are quite different. These things are not different. They're all folded together in their body of law. All right, so now we're going to pick back up. I'm going to skip a little bit because this video is getting long, and I want to make sure that we don't get too long. So now we're going to skip forward here, and now listen to this. This is good stuff.
Back to the narrative frame. So the Israelites leave Egypt. They come to the foot of Mount Sinai. We have this display of divine power. The Ten Commandments, 10 words are revealed. Moses comes down from Mount Sinai. Moses is about to come down from Mount Sinai.
If you haven't seen the movie The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston as Moses, then what he's talking about is how Moses delivers the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, to the Hebrews.
Still up there on the mountain, but all of a sudden, the text sort of, dare I say it, loses track of the forward momentum of the story, and we now start to get a whole series of blocks of material which interfere with the ongoing narrative. And right after the Ten Commandments, we have this block of material that modern scholars call the Covenant Code. Code here does not mean a cipher by which we try to conceal information. That's not what we mean by code. Code here is a word from Latin codex, right? A law code, right? Called by modern Bible scholars the Covenant Code. And if you went to Hebrew school, you would call it Mishpatim, Covenant Code. This begins with depends exactly where you start, but it has a brief section about the altar, then immediately begins with, and these are the Mishpatim. How do you translate Mishpatim? Precepts. Okay. Ela Mishpatim asher tasim lefneihem. Right? These are the something, precepts, observances, laws, proper way of doing things that you shall set before them. That you, Moses, shall set before them. So it looks like it's God talking to Moses. And where is Moses at this moment? He's still up at the top of Mount Sinai. He hasn't come back down yet until chapter 32. So he's still up here, up in chapter 21. So Moses is still up at Mount Sinai, and apparently we're meant to understand this is God talking to Moses, and these are the precepts, observances, customs, proper ways of doing things that you shall set before them. Then comes a paragraph about buying a Hebrew slave, whatever that means exactly. Right? And then we work our way through a series of laws, which are, you and I would call mostly you and I would say are civil laws, including the famous goring oxen. My ox gores your ox, which was the ancient equivalent of my Subaru smashes into your Chevrolet, right? Namely an automobile accident. Property damage, what lawyers call torts.
Now, this is one of the reasons why Christian people say that the Ten Commandments are the foundation of Western laws. And they are. And that drives atheists nuts. But they are. They just are.
Or similarly, damage if I punch you in the nose. That's what the Covenant Code is about. Mostly, there's some things you and I would call criminal law in there, as well as some things you and I would call ritual law or religious law, but it is for the mostly what you and I would call civil law. This goes on for several chapters. As scholars have long noted, the content of these laws, especially the civil laws part, I lost track of my sentence, is or are? I'll start that sentence over again. Right. The content of these civil laws is very similar to the content of the great law codes of the ancient Near East. The most famous of these is the Code of Hammurabi. I'm sure you heard about in high school history. right? But the Code of Hammurabi is not the first or only of these great civil law codes, the great law codes of the ancient Near East. There are a whole bunch of them. And just as the Israelite flood story seems to resemble and share many characteristics with the old Babylonian flood story, similarly, the laws of the Covenant Code seem to share many characteristics and fundamental points of connection with the great old Near Eastern law codes. Now here I need to comment on Mr. Kugel, who here is very bothered by this fact. Does this mean...
Kugel, by the way, is the textbook that he's relying upon for the course, one of the texts.
That the laws of the Torah don't come from God. I don't know why at this point Mr. Kugel decides to wax theologically sensitive, right? Except it's no worse, no less of a problem than everything else where we have parallels and discussions and how we understand divine revelation and so on. So I don't quite understand why he's much exercised about this, but he is. Anyway, we have here an Israelite law code which has clear points of contact, resemblance to the ancient law codes, and some modern Bible scholars have said flat out, the Israelites copied it. You know, they had Hammurabi code on the desk, and while the Israelite scribe is turning it into Hebrew. That's a recent thesis in a recent book by David Wright. Okay. To which my response would be to say is, well, the Israelites copy it, if that's the right word, or were inspired by the ancient law codes of the ancient Near East. But my response would be to say is, well, is that problematic? By whose law codes should they be inspired, if not by the codes of the ancient Near East? This for them is their culture. This is their civilization. Why are we surprised? They don't make up laws out of the blue. They didn't land here from Mars, right? They are part and parcel of the ancient Near Eastern society and civilization. So, their laws sound and look like laws of the ancient Near East. I didn't find that particularly shocking. It would be shocking if it were otherwise. Next, the key point here, just as in the flood story. Remember the flood story? Yes, we remember the flood story. Remember the flood story. Right. The Israelites take an ancient Babylonian flood story and turn it into a morality story. It's all about sin. It's all about God punishing the wicked. That's not in the Babylonian flood story, nor in any ancient flood story that we have. That's the Israelite twist on it. Turns it into a morality tale. People are wicked, God punishes them. That's what makes it Israelite. Similarly, when the Israelites take the laws of the ancient Near East, they turn them into Israelite laws. They are no longer the same as they once were. They're now something different. And here are 3 bullet points, which I think discuss this point, and here I'm much indebted to a famous article by the late Moshe Greenberg. The article is called Some Postulates of Biblical Criminal Law, which he brings out these points and does so brilliantly, at least I think so. So here are these fundamental points. How do we see Israelite society, culture, values in a law code which is otherwise indebted to the great law codes of the ancient Near East? Well, answer is we do. First, God himself is the legislator. God himself is the legislator. Elsewhere in the ancient Near East, the legislative authority is the king. Now the king, like Hammurabi, immediately boasts that he is a pious and faithful, loyal worshiper of whatever god at hand. True. So the king will claim that his royal authority comes from God. True. But at the end of the day, it's Hammurabi who's signing off on the law code. The authority behind the law code is Hammurabi, is the king. Whereas the Israelite law code or I'd say broadly in the Torah, the authority behind the laws is God. In fact, as some modern Bible scholars have observed, and as far as I know they are correct, the idea that you have in the book of Deuteronomy that the king is subservient to the law is an innovation of Israelite political thinking. The idea that even the king has to obey the law, even the king is subordinate to the law, that there is no sovereign immunity.
If that isn't at the heart of Western law, I don't know what is. No man is above the law. Equality under the law. Isn't that something?
That seems to be a product of Israelite political thinking. And that's witnessed here in this law code because God is the legislator, not the king. Or it's not Moses. Now there's an interesting footnote, interesting problem here. We got the book of Deuteronomy. Moses occasionally does talk in the first person singular, or often the first person singular in Deuteronomy. It's not clear whether it's God first person singular or it's Moses. But that's Deuteronomy. Here I would say there are some problematic verses in Deuteronomy which I freely acknowledge. But I think fundamentally, even in Deuteronomy, it's Moses talking on behalf of God. It's not Moses who's commanding the law, it's God. Next, there is equality before the law. One characteristic of the Code of Hammurabi is that we have different social classes suffer different penalties for the same crime. And this is a motif that you will find throughout the law codes of human civilization, from ancient till, I'm sorry to say, modern times. If you are a landowner, if you are a person of certain value, then this punishment you suffer is less than that, of course, of riffraff, lower elements in society. This is found throughout the Hammurabi law codes and other codes of the ancient Near East. Whereas in the Covenant Code, the book of Exodus, there are no such distinctions. A criminal is a criminal is a criminal. A malefactor is a malefactor. Social class is not mentioned because it apparently is irrelevant. Now, before we start going gaga and get excited about the egalitarian quality of Israelite society, we need to immediately emphasize that, of course, this is a slave society. So let's not get too carried away by this egalitarian ideal of ancient Israelite law. Okay, we've got to acknowledge that. That's there.
We also have to acknowledge the fact that people are filled with sin and imperfection. And that's another key message of the Judeo-Christian thought. And just read the book of Job. You know, people question, they get challenged, they have difficulty, curse God and die. And so, people are imperfect and they screw up and they are filled with sin. And so, but let's also point out the fact that if it hadn't been for the Quakers, they were the people that started the anti-slavery movement in Pennsylvania in the United States in the 1800s. And so this is something that is a catalyst. These ideas take generations to truly unfold and be appreciated.
But as I said again, right here there is an egalitarian streak which is conspicuously absent in the other great ancient law codes in the ancient Near East, and is conspicuously found in these laws, both of the Covenant Code and indeed generally in the Torah. And that brings us to perhaps one of the most famous, or should I say infamous, laws in the Covenant Code, called the Lex Talionis, which is Latin for law of retaliation. Right? In the Latin word talion, you can see the English word retaliation. It's the same root, same word. Right? In which the lawgiver says, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. A hand for a hand, and a hand for a hand, or a foot for a foot, or perhaps leg for a leg. A burn for a burn, a blow for a blow, or a wound for a wound. That's the fullest version of it in Exodus 21. This law, so-called law of talion, or law of retaliation, is often cited as evidence for the cruelty, barbarism, pick some other not nice words, right, about the ancient biblical law, right? Now we need to wait for moral progress to get beyond the law of eye for an eye. To which I would say, well, all right, maybe, but you've got to understand again what this law comes to include and what this law comes to exclude. That human society can progress beyond eye for an eye, I freely acknowledge, but we need to acknowledge that within its context, an eye for an eye was indeed progressive. It was not cruel at all.
I don't know what's going on. Hold on a second.
Because what an eye for an eye means in context, I think, is that there is to be fair and just compensation for injury. So an eye for an eye means an eye for an eye, not two eyes for an eye. Or not an eye and an ear. Or not an eye, an ear, and a neck for an eye. Arguing that there is to be fair compensation. Similarly, the idea that I damage you, I cause you harm, in reply you cause me harm, can be progressive if the alternative is I cause you harm and you kill my children.
Now, he doesn't point this out, I don't think, in this video. I've watched it several times and I don't recall him saying this, but it's important to note that the Hebrews were the first people on earth to outlaw physical punishment for property crimes. Physical punishment was reserved for moral crimes, crimes against God and crimes against sacred things.
If that's the alternative, then I would say eye for an eye is pretty damn progressive. There's a lovely note on this point in the JSB on 2131, right, where
the JSB is the Jewish Study Bible.
Scripture has an odd verse about the goring ox, where the Scripture has a line about the goring ox, and it says, "Ben yigach bat yigach kamishpat hazeh ye'aseh lo," right? And if the goring ox strikes a son or a daughter, the same rule shall apply. Namely, that we kill the ox. If you look at the note in the JSB, why does Scripture add this mysterious line? Doesn't matter if the ox kills a person, previous sentence, or whether it hits a son or a daughter. Because in the law of Hammurabi, if my ox kills your son or daughter, you get to kill my son or daughter. So the Israelite law comes to say, no, we don't do that. So, before we dismiss eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth as a sign of Israelite cruelty, barbarism, etc., 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 which we have to wait around for human progress, I would say, in context, this is progress. Because it all depends, the question is, compared to what, compared to who, in what context? And within that context, I think eye for an eye is perfectly progressive. We're on a trajectory here. By the time we get to the rabbis, many centuries down the road, the rabbis will argue that eye for an eye means money for an eye, what we're familiar with, i.e. torts. If I punch you in the nose and cause you damage, then I have to pay. We assess damage. That's what the rabbis say is what the passage really means. And here I have to admit, I'm not sure the passage really means money for an eye, but I acknowledge what the rabbis are trying to say is that the passage means fair compensation. And by that criterion, eye for an eye is indeed progressive, or indeed is not unreasonable. So check the syllabus before Wednesday's class, because there probably will be major changes. I look forward to seeing you.
Okay, so what have we learned here? So we learned that the wisdom of the Hebrews fundamentally is different than anything that their neighbors had at that time. We've seen that their structure of the universe, where they do not posit a metadivine realm from which all power exudes, they say that God is the ground of being, and that has certain philosophical consequences which we listened to Professor Hayes explain for us. And then we listened to Rabbi Cohen talk about the ways in which the laws, the covenant code, and the Decalogue reflect that worldview, and how they were, although similar on the surface, profoundly different than the law codes of their neighbors. The pagan worldview states, and I'm quoting Dr. Hayes here, that the seeds of good and evil are contained in the metadivine world. But in the Judeo-Christian worldview, the seeds of the modern world are in God, in the kingdom of God. When we make God our king, in other words, when we keep, like it says, like Dr. Cohen said, no one's above the law, equality under the law, and the law comes from God. When we do that, we make God our king. And when we do that, certain things happen. So rather than positing, as the pagans do, that good and evil is an inherent in the universe, and that the seeds for it are contained in the metadivine world, then we learn that God is the seed that transforms the world. And so that's how we get these parables. And so I'm going to share with you, to wrap up this parable, which is Matthew 4:30, which is the parable of the mustard seed. And this is Christ speaking. He said, "To what shall we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable can we use for it? It is like a mustard seed that, when it is sown in the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on the earth. But once it is sown, it springs up and becomes the largest of plants and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the sky can dwell in its shade." With many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to understand it. Hey, sorry about that. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the computer errored out there, and I got to add on this little addendum because of the error. So that pretty much concludes the episode 5, which is the wisdom of the Hebrews. And in the next episode, we're going to do the wisdom of the New Testament. Not sure exactly how I'm gonna title that yet, but the working title right now is the New Testament, the encounter of the Hebrews with the West. But that's just the way I'm leaning right now. I hope you're enjoying this and you're sticking with it. And then also next time we're going to get into, well, no sense going any further. Thanks for watching. Take care.